the 1st of March, 1945. A concrete launch tower rises out of a forest clearing in southern Germany, barely disguised among the pine trees. Strapped upright inside a slender wooden aircraft mounted vertically on that tower is a test pilot named Lothar Sieber. Beneath him, 5 solid-fuel rocket boosters and a liquid-fuel rocket engine wait to throw him into the sky faster than any manned aircraft in history has ever left the ground. He has never flown this machine before. Nobody has. This is the first manned vertical rocket launch in the history of aviation, and Lothar Sieber has volunteered to be the man who proves whether it can be done at all. The countdown reaches 0, the engines ignite, and the aircraft leaves the tower with a force that presses him back into his seat harder than anything a human body had ever been asked to survive in a flying machine before. Ground crew and engineers watch from a safe distance, some of them holding stopwatches, others simply staring upward, aware that whatever happens in the next 60 seconds will determine whether years of frantic, improvised engineering had produced a workable weapon or an elaborate way to kill the man volunteering to test it. For a handful of seconds, it works exactly as the engineers on the ground had promised. Then something goes wrong, and less than a minute after leaving the ground, Lothar Sieber is dead. Pause on that, because the machine that killed him had been designed, from its very first sketch, around a single unsettling idea. It was supposed to be thrown away, not eventually, not after years of service like every other fighter aircraft of the war. Almost immediately, after a single flight, most of it was meant to be destroyed on purpose. This is the story of the Bachem Ba 349 Natter, the aircraft Germany built to be disposable, and the man who became the first thing it actually disposed of. By the final year of the Second World War, Germany's air defenses were collapsing under a weight of numbers it could no longer match. American and British heavy bombers were crossing German airspace by the thousand, escorted by fighters that outnumbered and increasingly outflew what remained of the German fighter arm. Trained pilots were dying faster than replacements could be produced. Fuel for conventional aircraft was running desperately short, rationed so tightly that entire squadrons sat grounded on airfields for lack of anything to put in their tanks. And the aluminum that modern fighters were built from was being funneled toward a shrinking number of factories that Allied bombing campaigns were methodically destroying one raid at a time. Out of that desperation came what the German Air Ministry called the Emergency Fighter Program, a frantic search for anything that could be built quickly, cheaply, and out of materials that did not compete with the rest of the collapsing war economy. Committees reviewed dozens of radical proposals in the space of weeks rather than years, evaluating designs that in peacetime would never have survived their first meeting. Some of these proposals were nearly as strange as the Natter itself. Aircraft built around scavenged parts, single-use engines, and construction techniques designed for factories with no skilled labor left to staff them. Most of them were rejected outright, dismissed as impractical even by the desperate standards of that final year. One was not. Its designer was an engineer named Erich Bachem, who had spent years working as a technical director at the Fieseler Aircraft Company, where he had helped develop small, practical aircraft rather than the large bombers and headline-grabbing fighters that had defined most of Germany's pre-war aviation industry. Bachem was not one of the towering names of German aviation in the way that some of his contemporaries were. He had built a career on practical, unglamorous engineering rather than headline-grabbing prototypes, eventually leaving Fieseler to establish his own small aircraft manufacturing company, a modest operation with none of the resources or reputation of the larger firms competing for the same emergency fighter contracts. It was precisely that practical, resourceful instinct that shaped the aircraft he now proposed. If Germany no longer had the aluminum, the fuel, or the trained pilots to build and fly conventional interceptors in meaningful numbers, then the solution was not to build a better version of the same aircraft. It was to abandon almost every assumption that conventional aircraft design had ever made. The competition for the emergency fighter program was fierce, even among firms with far greater resources than Bachem's small company could offer. Established manufacturers submitted proposals built around more conventional principles: jet propulsion, simplified metal airframes, designs that tried to preserve as much of existing aircraft doctrine as possible, while cutting costs and construction time wherever they could. Bachem's proposal stood apart precisely because it refused to compromise with convention at all. Where other designers were trying to build a cheaper fighter, Bachem was proposing something closer to a guided weapon with a man temporarily riding inside it, an idea radical enough that some of the officials reviewing it were reportedly uncertain, at first, whether to treat it as a serious aircraft proposal or as something closer to an anti-aircraft rocket that happened to carry a pilot. Bachem's proposal was built almost entirely out of wood, a material Germany still had in abundance, and that required none of the specialized factories or skilled metalworkers that aluminum construction demanded. It needed no runway, because Germany's runways were being cratered by Allied bombing raids faster than they could be repaired. Instead, it would launch straight up, standing on its tail on a simple vertical rack, propelled into the sky by rocket power alone. And instead of a slow, expensive training program to produce experienced fighter pilots, it was designed to be flown, at least in theory, after only the barest minimum of instruction, because its mission would be brutally short and almost entirely automated in its approach to the target. The aircraft carried a single pilot, a single liquid-fuel rocket engine capable of an enormous but short burst of thrust, and a nose packed with unguided rockets rather than machine guns, designed to be fired in a single devastating volley directly into the heart of a bomber formation. There was no need for careful aim through a gun sight the way a conventional fighter required, because the weapon itself was a spread of rockets meant to saturate the airspace around an approaching bomber stream. Climb, fire, and then, if the pilot survived that far, get out. The construction itself reflected the same relentless pragmatism. Most of the airframe was built from ordinary plywood and simple wooden spars, assembled using woodworking techniques that furniture makers and cabinet builders across Germany could be quickly retrained to perform, sidestepping the shortage of skilled aircraft metalworkers entirely. There was no retractable undercarriage to design, machine, or maintain, because the aircraft never needed to land under its own power in the conventional sense at all. There was no need for a long runway, no need for the fuel-intensive taxiing and takeoff roll that consumed so much of a conventional fighter's limited flight time. The entire vertical launch concept was built around a simple steel tower, cheap to construct and easy to hide among trees or inside a modest clearing. A stark contrast to the sprawling, heavily bombed airfields that had become death traps for Germany's remaining conventional fighter squadrons. Even the pilot training reflected this same brutal simplification. A conventional fighter pilot in 1944 required months, sometimes years of instruction before he could be trusted in combat, flying dozens of different aircraft types through an increasingly complex syllabus of aerobatics, gunnery, and formation flying. The Natter was designed around the assumption that its pilot would need only the barest introduction to its controls, because the vertical launch itself would be almost entirely automated, guided by a simple autopilot system through the initial climb, leaving the pilot responsible only for a brief period of manual control near the target and the act of firing the rocket volley itself. It was, in the truest sense, a weapon designed to compress years of pilot training into days, built for a country that no longer had years, or the fuel to spend on training flights, to spare. The production plan that grew out of this same philosophy was as radical as the aircraft itself. Rather than concentrating manufacturing inside a single large factory, the kind of target that Allied bombers had become expert at locating and destroying, Bachem's company envisioned a dispersed network of small workshops scattered across the countryside, many of them staffed by workers with little or no prior aircraft manufacturing experience, building individual wooden components that could later be assembled at a handful of final assembly points closer to the intended launch sites. It was a manufacturing philosophy built around survival rather than efficiency, trading the economies of scale that a large centralized factory could offer for a production system that no single bombing raid could meaningfully interrupt. Planners spoke, at least on paper, of eventually producing hundreds of Natters a month through this dispersed system, numbers that in hindsight bore almost no relationship to what the collapsing German war economy could actually deliver in the months that remained. That final phrase, "get out," sat at the very center of the entire design philosophy, and it is worth pausing on exactly what it meant in practice. The Natter was never intended to land. After firing its rockets, the pilot was meant to bail out of the aircraft entirely, while the nose section containing the valuable and difficult-to-manufacture rocket engine would separate from the rest of the airframe and descend by its own parachute, to be recovered from the ground and reused in another aircraft. Everything else, the wooden fuselage, the wings, the simple undercarriageless structure that had carried both the pilot and the engine into the sky, was designed to be destroyed on impact and never touched again. It was, quite literally, an aircraft engineered around its own destruction, built to survive exactly one flight before being thrown away. The Natter was not, strictly speaking, Germany's first attempt at a rocket-powered point defense interceptor. That distinction belonged to the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, a swept-wing rocket fighter that had entered limited service earlier in the war, taking off conventionally from a runway, using a wheeled dolly before jettisoning it, and climbing at a rate no propeller-driven fighter could match. The Comet was faster than almost anything the Allies could put into the sky, and it demonstrated in a handful of genuine combat engagements that rocket power could work as a point defense weapon against high-altitude bomber formations. But the Comet was also extraordinarily dangerous to its own pilots, for reasons that had nothing to do with the enemy, built around a volatile and corrosive fuel combination that had a habit of exploding on landing if even a small amount leaked into the airframe, and it still required a functioning runway to take off and land from, the very resource that was becoming scarcest of all under the weight of Allied bombing. Bachem's design can be understood, in part, as a direct response to exactly those Comet shortcomings. If a rocket fighter no longer needed a runway at all, if it launched vertically from a simple concealed tower instead, then the increasingly cratered and closely watched German airfields ceased to be a vulnerability. And if the aircraft was never expected to land under its own power in the first place, an enormous category of the Comet's most dangerous failure modes simply disappeared, along with the requirement that had caused them. In that sense, the Natter was less a wholly original idea than the logical, radical extension of a lesson Germany had already learned, at real cost, from its first rocket interceptor. It simply carried that lesson to a conclusion far more extreme than anyone had previously attempted, discarding not just the runway but the entire aircraft itself as something worth preserving beyond a single flight. The intended combat mission reflected the same uncompromising logic that had shaped every other part of the design. A Natter would sit hidden and ready near a suspected bomber route, camouflaged among trees close to its launch tower, requiring only ground crew and a pilot on standby rather than the extensive infrastructure a conventional airfield demanded. When an approaching bomber formation was detected, the pilot would climb into the cockpit, the tower would be aligned toward the expected path of the enemy aircraft, and the launch sequence would begin. Within roughly a minute, the aircraft would reach an altitude where conventional bombers flew, at a speed that gave enemy escort fighters almost no warning and very little opportunity to intervene before the rockets were fired. It was designed, in effect, as a kind of manned surface-to-air missile, a weapon meant to strike quickly and then be finished, rather than a fighter meant to linger and maneuver in a prolonged engagement, the way every conventional aircraft of the era had been built to do. If a story like this, a machine built to be sacrificed on purpose in the final desperate months of a collapsing war effort, is the kind of history that keeps you interested, this channel exists to keep telling stories like it properly. Subscribing is free, it takes only a moment, and it genuinely helps stories like this one find the people who would want to hear them. There is more of this coming. The engineering timeline behind the Natter was almost as extreme as the aircraft itself. Design work began in earnest toward the end of 1944, and within a matter of weeks rather than the years a conventional aircraft program would have required. The first unpowered glide tests were already underway, towed into the air behind another aircraft to verify that the basic aerodynamic shape could fly and be controlled at all before anyone risked a rocket-powered launch. Those early glide tests revealed exactly the kind of problems a rushed program would be expected to find. Minor instabilities in the controls, questions about how the aircraft would behave at the extreme speeds a full rocket launch would demand, details that in a peacetime program might have taken months to resolve through careful incremental testing. In the final winter of the war, there was no time for careful and incremental. There was only time to fix what could be fixed quickly and move forward regardless of what could not. Those glide tests were promising enough that the program moved almost immediately toward powered testing. First with unmanned launches to confirm that the vertical rocket takeoff itself was survivable for the airframe, and then, in the final weeks of February and the beginning of March 1945, toward the moment every rocket program eventually has to face. A human being would have to be strapped into the machine and sent into the sky to find out what the instruments and the calculations could not fully predict on their own. Lothar Sieber was chosen for that first manned vertical launch. He was an experienced pilot, though not one who had trained for years on this specific kind of vertical rocket ascent, because no such training existed anywhere in the world before this program. What little is known about him beyond the bare facts of that final flight comes largely from surviving program records rather than any detailed personal account, the kind of gap in the historical record that is common to test pilots throughout the earliest and most dangerous years of any new form of flight. Men whose names survive mostly attached to the machines they died testing, rather than to any fuller account of who they were. He climbed the launch tower on the 1st of March 1945, knowing, as well as anyone in that program could know, that he was volunteering to test something no human being had ever survived attempting before. Pause on that. Because whatever else can be said about the desperation of that final year of the war, the courage required to strap into an untested rocket aircraft and be launched vertically into the sky, for the very first time in human history, deserves to be acknowledged honestly, regardless of which uniform the man wore or which cause he was serving. What happened during those final seconds of his ascent has been reconstructed since, largely from wreckage and from what little telemetry and eyewitness evidence survived the chaos of that final winter of the war. The aircraft left the tower successfully, accelerating with a violence that the human body had never been asked to absorb in a piloted aircraft before. Somewhere in the seconds that followed, the canopy over the cockpit appears to have come loose, torn away, or shattered under the extreme aerodynamic forces of that climb, and the aircraft began to break apart around him while it was still climbing. It came down in the forest near the launch site less than a minute after it had left the ground. Lothar Sieber did not survive. Here is the sentence that sits at the center of this entire story, and it is worth saying plainly rather than softening it. An aircraft engineered from its very first sketch to be thrown away, built around the assumption that its pilot would survive to bail out, while only the machine itself was sacrificed, killed the first man who ever flew it in under a minute, before it had disposed of a single piece of itself on purpose. The disposable weapon disposed of the wrong thing first. The Natter program did not end immediately after that first fatal launch. A small number of additional Natters were completed and prepared in the final weeks of the war, positioned at launch sites intended to intercept Allied bomber formations as they approached targets deep inside Germany. But the collapse of the German war effort in April and May of 1945 overtook the program before it could ever demonstrate what it had actually been designed to do in real combat. Advancing Allied forces overran several of the launch sites before any operational interception had taken place. No Natter is confirmed to have destroyed an enemy aircraft in combat. The weapon built to be used exactly once against the enemy never managed to complete that single mission at all. Instead, the only confirmed casualty of the entire program was the volunteer test pilot who had flown it first. There is a particular kind of irony worth sitting with here, because it is not a simple one. The entire logic of the Natter had been built around minimizing loss, around the idea that in a war, Germany was rapidly losing the material and the men to continue fighting conventionally. A machine that sacrificed only wood and rocket fuel, while preserving both the pilot and the valuable engine, represented a rational, even humane response to an impossible strategic position. And yet the very first time that logic was tested against reality, in the person of a single volunteer pilot climbing a launch tower in a Bavarian forest, it produced exactly the outcome the entire design had been built to avoid. The machine survived long enough to be recovered from the wreckage and studied. The man did not. By the time the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, the emergency fighter program that had produced the Natter, along with dozens of similarly radical and rushed proposals from that same final desperate year, had failed to meaningfully change the outcome of the air war over Germany in any of the ways its designers had hoped. The bomber formations the Natter had been built to intercept continued flying largely unimpeded by anything the program ever managed to put into the sky in meaningful numbers. Erich Bachem's practical, resourceful engineering had produced a genuinely novel solution to a set of problems that, by the time it was ready to be tested, no longer had any solution at all. The war it had been designed to help win was already lost before the aircraft ever had a real chance to prove itself. What survives of the Natter today exists mostly in museum collections and in the technical reports written by Allied investigators who studied the captured airframes and documents after the war ended, trying to understand exactly what German engineers had been attempting to build in those final desperate months. Several of those investigators noted, with a mixture of professional respect and clear discomfort, just how coherent the underlying engineering logic actually was, even as they recognized how little chance the program had ever really had of changing the course of a war that was already effectively over by the time it reached its first manned test. A handful of surviving airframes and reconstructed examples exist today in aviation museums, small wooden shapes standing upright the way they were always meant to be launched, quiet reminders of a program that promised speed and simplicity and delivered, in the end, mostly a single tragedy and a great deal of wasted material. The wider emergency fighter program that produced the Natter tells a similar story across almost every one of its other proposals. Jet-powered fighters rushed into production with barely tested engines, simplified aircraft built from whatever scrap materials remained available, weapons designed on paper in a matter of days and built in a matter of weeks. Almost none of them arrived in meaningful numbers before the war ended, and almost none of them changed the fundamental arithmetic of a collapsing air war fought against an enemy with overwhelming numerical and industrial superiority. The Natter was, in that sense, not an aberration within German aviation policy in 1945. It was simply the most extreme and the most honestly named example of a much broader pattern, an entire industry racing to build disposable machines for a war effort that had itself already become, in every practical sense, disposable. When Allied technical intelligence teams reached the Bachem factories and launch sites in the closing weeks and months of the war, they found an operation that had never come close to the production numbers its planners had once envisioned. A handful of completed airframes, a launch tower or two, incomplete components scattered across small workshops that had been overtaken by advancing armies before they could finish their work. The interrogations conducted afterward with surviving engineers and officials involved in the program painted a picture of an effort that had been technically ambitious and organizationally almost impossible, hampered at every stage by the same shortages of fuel, materials, and skilled labor that the entire design had been created to work around in the first place. The dispersed manufacturing network that had promised resilience against bombing had instead struggled simply to coordinate itself across a country whose transportation and communication systems were disintegrating by the week. It is worth being honest, before closing, about what this story is and is not. It would be easy to tell it as a simple parable about the folly of desperate wartime engineering, a case study in how far a collapsing regime will go in pursuit of a weapon that might reverse an unwinnable situation, and there is truth in that reading. It would also be easy, and equally incomplete, to tell it only as a story about a doomed machine, and to let the man who died testing it disappear into a footnote the way so many test pilots throughout aviation history have disappeared into footnotes beneath the aircraft they were flying. It is worth adding, too, that the historical record around the Natter program is thinner and more fragmentary than the record for most of the aircraft this channel usually covers. Pieced together after the war, from surviving German documents, Allied intelligence reports, and physical wreckage, rather than from the kind of extensive squadron records and after-action reports that exist for aircraft flown in years rather than weeks of active service. Some details of exactly what happened in those final seconds of Sieber's flight remain uncertain even now, reconstructed rather than directly observed, and that uncertainty deserves to be acknowledged rather than smoothed over into false confidence. What is not uncertain is this. Lothar Sieber volunteered to fly a machine that no human being had ever flown before, built around an entirely new and untested method of getting into the sky, in the final desperate winter of a war that both he and the engineers who built it must have known, on some level, was already lost. Whatever judgment history renders on the war itself, the courage required to climb that launch tower deserves to be remembered honestly, rather than reduced to a single grim statistic in a story about wooden rockets. The aircraft that was built to be thrown away disposed of almost nothing according to plan. It never fired its rockets at an enemy bomber. It never released its valuable engine for recovery and reuse the way its entire design had promised it would. The one thing it did, in the very first minute of its very first manned flight, was take the life of the man sitting inside it, before it had ever gotten the chance to do anything else at all. If you have made it this far, this channel exists to keep telling stories exactly like this one, about the machines built in the most desperate circumstances imaginable, and the men who volunteered to find out whether they actually worked. Subscribing is free, it takes only a few seconds, and it genuinely helps stories like this one find the people who would want to hear them. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.